Good morning, and thank you for joining this live BSI webinar on prioritising people, the route to a successful, sustainable and resilient aerospace sector. I am Francesca Bailey, and I'm here today to help facilitate the webinar. With me today are our guest speakers, Brendon Hill and Kate Field. Brendon has been in aviation and engineering for 41 years, including 26 years as a British Army officer and aircraft engineer, and serving in many theatres of operation, as well as in quality management roles. Brendon has been in business assurance and certification for 13 years, 7 with BSI, where he has developed BSI services to aerospace. Brendon is a member of several IAQG committees and writing teams, providing thought leadership to the aerospace industry. Brendon is currently the Global Head of Aerospace at BSI. Kate Field. Kate is BSI's Global Occupational Health, Safety and Wellbeing expert, driving a global strategy agenda for creating a safer workplace. An ambassador for cultural change that puts well-being, PPE equality and safety at the forefront, Kate inspires colleagues and stakeholders globally to make a difference. With over 18 years industry experience in occupational health and safety, Kate is a recognised consultant, trainer and qualified lecturer. Prior to joining BSI, Kate was Head of Information and Intelligence at the Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, leading on health and safety research strategy and technical content globally. Other experience includes Regulatory Inspector and Policy Programme Lead for the HSE and Health and Safety Expert at Augusta Westland, Bureau Veritas and EasyJet. So you're in safe hands with our experts today. Before Brendon and Kate begin, I just want to make you aware that you've joined this webinar in a mute-only mode, so you cannot talk to each other or to us, as there are quite a few of you on the line today. However, please feel free to type your questions into the questions box in your webinar control panel, and we will do our best to answer them in the Q&A section at the end of the presentation. We will also run polls during the course of the webinar to engage with you and gain your feedback. If for any reason you're unable to vote on any of our polls, please come out of the full screen viewing mode, as this should help resolve the issue. At the end of the webinar, we will run a survey to ask you what you thought of the webinar today. I'd also like to point out that we're running this webinar remotely from our homes, so although we hope this won't be the case, if there are any technical hitches, background disruption, please do accept our apologies and bear with us. Now, over to Brendon, who will kick off this morning's webinar presentation.
Thanks, Fran, and good morning, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. Before we start off, I'd just like to give you a quick introduction to BSI. We are the British Standards Institution. We're the world's first national standards body, and we've been around since 1901. And we have a few departments within our organisation. We have the organisation which writes our standards, so Knowledge Solutions. And then we have Assurance, where we do assessment and certification, product certification and training. So it's a very broad portfolio there. Regulatory, which is our medical devices certification, and we're the biggest player in the world on medical devices in that particular area. And then consulting, where we have a broad range of expertise and all sorts of business consulting and development, including things like cyber and so on. So we have a very broad portfolio, so we can be a partner for you in all aspects of your business life. A few key facts about BSI then. We were founded in 1901 and we were a founding member of ISO. And we shaped 10 of the top 12 most widely used ISO standards. So all those things tell you that we are a thought leader, an innovator, a creator in the field. We now have 93 offices globally, 5,000 colleagues, 12,000 plus technical experts and 84,000 clients in 193 countries, including, somewhat bizarrely, Antarctica. Quite what we do there, I don't know, but it just goes to show we are everywhere. So we work for the public good to improve, standardize and simplify business systems. And any profit we make is invested back into BSI. It's not distributed. So we're not a commercial company. We don't have shareholders to look after and so on. Anything is invested back in the company, which helps drive our continuous improvement in innovation and thought leadership. If you like, it's a miniature circular economy. So we're truly independent without bias or vested interests. And we are committed to the UN Sustainable Development Goals and working hard on those, and of course supporting our clients in achievement of those. So our mission then summarised is to share knowledge, innovation and best practice to help people and organisations to make excellence a habit. Now, before we start off, we'd like to get an understanding of where you are at the moment. So we're going to start off with a poll to gauge your current circumstances. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague briefly for that.
Thank you, Brendon. So poll number 1. Has your organisation planned for physical and psychological health measures in response to COVID-19? Please select 1. Yes, extensive planning. Yes, some planning. Little or no planning. Or I don't know. I'll just give you a few seconds there just to respond to that. And just a reminder while you're doing that, feel free to add any questions you have in the control panel, and then we can come to them at the end of the webinar. Okay, I think we're good with that. Excellent. So we have 36% yes to extensive planning, 43% yes, some planning, 14% little or no planning, and 7% don't know. So back over to you, Brendon, to comment on the results.
Thanks, Fran, and thank you for giving us the answers to the poll question. So it's reassuring that 36% of you have done extensive and indeed 43 have done some. So the large proportion of you have done a fair bit of work towards this. So we'll keep them in mind as we go through, but there will be things, no matter where you are in those 4 levels, there will be things in here which will help you develop and build on what you've already done. So let's have a quick review of what happened to the aerospace sector due to COVID-19. Pretty sad tale. There, the diagram there shows that it literally went off a cliff edge. Never seen anything like it before. Aerospace has been steadily growing since the 60s, a nice steady growth rate. Indeed, towards the end of the 2018-2019 was increasing its growth rate as more and more people enjoyed traveling around the world. So we went a cliff edge, immediate downturn, demand plummeted to the level of the 1990s. It's been the biggest effect on the ordinary citizen since World War II. Continents shut down, civil rights restricted in an effort to reduce infection rates. And all this has infected people. So this is the important point. It is often said by CEOs that our business is made by our people. I'm sure you've heard that many times. Well, they've all been affected by this, and in several ways, quite possibly. So the commercial effect on aviation year on year is a 49% drop. So airlines have been struggling to stay alive, indeed, as many have gone to the wall. Aircraft are in storage, wide bodies are being retired. We're all wondering about how quickly the industry is going to recover. And all these are stress factors. They all bring in fear and concern for people with their jobs and job security and so on. The aerospace industry is pretty much dependent on tourism. Tourism is 10% of the global GDP. So in effect, aerospace rides on the back of that growth in global tourism and growth in global GDP. So it was comfortable and predictable with good margins and so on. And then overnight, it changed. And the effects have been staggering. So international flights dropped 68%. This is an interesting one on Aircrew. 57% of commercial pilots are not flying. 30% are unemployed, 17% furloughed, and 10% are working but not in flying roles. I was reading an article yesterday about a pilot who's opened a cafe in Belfast. I wouldn't have thought opening a cafe was particularly the best of plans at the moment, but there we are, that's what he's done. So there's lots of pilots that have gone to different things. So of those that are flying or furloughed, 82% are concerned about job security. So the pilot-airline relationship is broken. There's lots of talk about pay cuts, pay reduction, the security of tenure, the job security, which is important to underlying well-being, that's gone. So effects and concerns about home and family life and potentially, of course, bereavement, let's not forget that. and well-being during lockdown. Stress is up, mental health is challenged. It's interesting to note that there were 4 crashes in 2020, with 332 people being killed. 3 of those were down to bad airmanship. So currency of aircrew is a concern as well. And of course, the aircrew that are flying will be aware of that. The regulators have changed the rules. They've reduced the requirements for currency. So we've had an example of a captain had not had a proficiency check for 6 months, and the first officer had not been checked in 12 months in one of those cases. So it's greater risk, greater concern. And the same applies to cabin crew. They're dealing with all the things above, plus they're dealing with passengers who in turn are dealing with COVID. I'm sure everybody has seen some of these headlines with unruly passengers on aircraft that refused to comply with the rules, had to be dragged off the aircraft, not wearing masks and so on. And that's additional stress for the cabin crew. So there's a lot to deal with. And a survey was done by ICAO, and it asked whether aircrew think their mental health has been affected by the pandemic. And it's interesting to see the reduction over time, or sorry, over age groups. Now, there are a possible couple of conclusions here. It's only a guess, but those that are in the sort of 55 to 64 years old area, they're closer retirements, are perhaps less worried, and they're probably more financially secure. Mortgages paid, children have finished university and so on. So all these things, family-wise, can be factors in the stress levels. But look at the younger ones, the 24-year-olds, the ones that are up and coming, wanting to get on, perhaps not got the financial security behind them, probably invested heavily in their training and so on. They're being most affected. The ground crew, they have similar issues to deal with, the maintenance crews, plus they've got new tasks. Storage of aircraft, removal from storage and return to service. These are unfamiliar tasks. So they're dealing with new things. They've got potentially reduced workforces, unfamiliar tasks, and new faults in aircraft. There have been a few aircraft that have had to turn back due to undetected issues, such as insects growing in pitostatic systems. So there's a lot of stress on the ground crew as well. And then in the supply chain, if we look at the manufacturing, we've had disruption and delays in production due to the short-term issues. They've got all the issues with human factors due to COVID, affecting all their staff. Cost down pressures, job security issues, and of course cash flow for those organizations, because all of a sudden the demand for new aircraft and parts and engines dropped off. So the whole survival of those organizations is at stake. So again, all those people have all those concerns about job security and so on. So there's a lot going on. So I'll hand over to my colleague Kate now to talk you through some of the psychological efforts.
Lovely, thank you, Brendon. So yeah, as we've heard, a huge impact on the whole of the aerospace industry, affecting the young and old in all types of job role. But I thought before we kind of go into some of the impact, it might be worth just spending a few moments actually talking about what psychological or mental health actually is. And I think sometimes there's a lot of misconception around mental health and mental illness, but it's really important we do understand what it does for us. And our mental health influences how we think, how we feel about ourselves and others, and also how we interpret events. So a really simple example of that, we've all had experience when we've been, queuing in a shop maybe, and somebody's jumped the queue. But and sometimes you go, yeah, whatever, and sometimes you're like, that's so annoying, and often that's reaction is related to actually how our mental health is in that moment, and we may be aware of that, or quite often we're not. And the other thing in terms of mental health is that it affects our capacity to learn, to communicate and to form and sustain relationships. In simple terms, it influences our ability to cope, particularly with change, but also, you know, transition and life events. And we have been dealing with a huge amount of change and life events in the last 12 months during the pandemic. And therefore our mental health is absolutely vital to help us deal with that. And of course, for many people, we have been struggling with our mental health, and therefore we have been struggling to cope with the change. And, you know, our mental health is as important as our physical health. And the better that it is, the better our life and our overall well-being and ability to engage and function will be. And it is important to understand that work plays a really important part in our health, both physical and mental. You know, overall, there's really robust research that shows that people who are in work are overall healthier and happier. But of course, sometimes work can have a negative impact. And right now, we've got a situation where we might be furloughed. So we're not in work, we're not out of work, but we've got this huge uncertainty, you know, and that concern, some of the things that Brendon touched on, you know, that concern about what's the future going to hold, career development, debt, all of those things are going on at the moment. So if we move on and just sort of reiterate in terms of mental illness. So we have mental health, which is, you know, the positive side, but obviously, you know, we have mental illness, and it's on exactly the same continuum as physical health and physical illness. You know, if we think about physical illness, we can be feeling absolutely physically fantastic. Then we might have a few days where we feel a little bit off colour, you know, maybe we've got a tummy upset. It doesn't necessarily affect us long term. We don't necessarily need to go and see the doctor. We don't necessarily need any other intervention, but we just feel a little bit off colour. Then we might have something more like an ongoing chronic condition like diabetes. Yes, you know, potentially problematic, but actually once it's managed and we're getting treatment, again, doesn't have any impact on our day-to-day life, and certainly not our working life. And then obviously we can have very severe physical illness. You know, we can have a cancer that can have a really huge impact over a short time, you know, a year or months while the treatment's going on, and then it goes into remission. And actually, again, you know, we continue, or we can have, you know, serious and ongoing illnesses. And it's exactly the same with mental illness. You know, we can just have a few days where we feel a little bit low, a little bit blue. We can have sort of the equivalent of feeling a bit off colour for a bit longer, where actually maybe we do need a little bit of time off. Maybe we do need to go to the doctor and get a bit of support in terms of medication, or actually, you know, talking therapies are really effective. But again, it's only short term, and once it passes, you know, it's not an ongoing issue. And then obviously there are, you know, much more serious mental illnesses which need long-term treatment. But again, even with those illnesses, you know, people can work and function perfectly well. So it's important we understand that continuum. And if we move on, the other part that we need to understand when we think about mental health is stress. Now, I'm sure many of you are aware, but it's just worth reflecting on what is stress. And then I'll come back to why it's important for mental health and mental illness. So stress is an amazing thing. It's our body's natural defense. It comes from the days of woolly mammoths and saber-toothed tigers, you know, when we had to either fight or flight, run away. And that's what our stress response is. So when something happens to us, this natural inbuilt chemical reaction kicks in. So we have kind of a flood of chemicals, so adrenaline and cortisol, all sorts of things, and then that has a knock-on impact in terms of physical reaction. So it speeds up our heart rate, it tightens our muscles ready for that fight or flight, our senses become more aware, so our pupils dilate. There's a whole range of things that happen. And as I say, it's perfectly normal, perfectly natural, automatic, and quite often we don't even notice that it's happening. But what's important to understand is that it can have physical, emotional, and mental impact. So if we move on, one of the things with stress is that it's great, you know, it's the thing that when a pilot is having difficulty, it's a stress response and his ability to react in that moment that actually can save the plane. It's the reaction that parents have in terms of, you know, having a new baby in the house, lack of sleep, but they can still function because actually it's a stress response that is going on. But the challenge with stress is when it is repeated or it is prolonged and it becomes excess, so excess pressure. And the immediate impacts of that is that from a mental point of view, you know, you can start to feel anxious, tend to be a lot more emotional, so faster to anger or tears. It has a real impact on our sort of mental capacity. So, you know, difficult to make decisions, difficult to concentrate. Actually, it impacts memory. I've mentioned some of the physical reactions already. And a really good one in terms of stress is people might huff and puff. I do this. So this is something I'm aware of. You know, if I'm feeling that excess pressure, I'm a sire. I puff a lot. And quite often people don't notice that. But again, because of the chemical reaction, your body needs to kind of equalize the pressure within it, so that sighing is part of that. And there may be behavioral impacts, you know, so changes to eating habit and everybody's different. So some people will eat more, some people will eat less. The same with sleeping, you know, some people will struggle to sleep, some people will want to sleep more. And you know, one of the ways that quite often people will deal with that stress is by you know, increasing smoking, drinking, or drug taking as a way of coping. And the other thing is you quite often see a change of appearance. So, you know, somebody who's shaves every day, somebody who does a makeup every day will potentially stop doing those activities. But the key thing with stress is when it is prolonged or repeated, those acute symptoms can start to become chronic, and this is where it starts to have an impact on our mental illness. So actually stress over excess stress, excess pressure over a prolonged period of time can lead to anxiety, depression, and even things like post-traumatic stress disorder. It can lead to physical illness, you know, things like irritable bowel syndromes, high blood pressure, immune suppression, even things like osteoporosis and eczema. And of course, you know, those behavioural elements can turn into problematic issues as well. They can lead to obesity or oh God, I knew I'd say I wouldn't be able to say this when I was doing it. Being too thin, there you go. But insomnia, diabetes, addiction, and overdose. So it's really important that we understand that relationship between stress and, when it happens for long term and repeated, serious physical and mental ill health. And if we move on, what does this mean in terms of the workplace? Well, we know that psychological health, and in particular psychological ill health, has been a major issue in the workplace for a long time. Occupational stress is you know, the most well-known issue. Sometimes that's termed as burnout when it's a particular type of stress, but as I've mentioned, you know, we can lead to anxiety and depression, and this can cost economies billions. And if we click once more, then we'll see, you know, we know from the studies and research out there that this can cost absolutely trillions of pounds across the economy. And of course, it has an impact in terms of sickness absence. And because of those implications that I've said about memory and concentration, actually, it can have an impact in terms of risk within an organisation and productivity and quality. And if we move on, there you go. That's the, it's the global economy, an estimated £1 trillion for depression and anxiety, which is just phenomenal. And this was before COVID as well. So if we move on, within the workplace, when we're thinking about the risk to psychological health, we use a particular term. We use the term psychosocial hazards. So these are the individual hazards that potentially can create that harm. And there are quite a number, but I'm just going to go through some of the most common ones. So job content. So actually, does it create fulfillment? Do we feel engaged? Do we feel that our skills are being used? Workload or pace of work. So this might be things like excess working hours, but also this can be too little work, or where work's controlled by machinery, if you like, if you're working on a production line. Work schedule, so similar but slightly different in terms of our working hours, our ability to have flexibility. And that then relates to control and our ability to make decisions about how we do the work and when we do it and in what way. And actually, that's really important. There are specific issues around, environment and equipment, and I'll come back to those. Culture is a really important one, and I'm going to come back to that. Relationships between peer and leadership, hugely important to our psychological health. That ability to feel part of a team, to feel supported, is absolutely critical. Role, do we know what our role is? What the expectations of our role are? Do we feel supported? Is there career development and continual learning? Again, coming back to whether we feel our skills are utilised. And of course, this constant or potential challenge between the balance between our home and our working life. And if we move on, they're the ones that tend to look kind of more in terms of the organisation and the way work is done. But actually, some of what we might think of as traditional safety issues can actually also give rise to psychological hazards. So noise. So if I said to you, imagine the sound of nails being drawn down a chalkboard, that sound. Some of you will have probably scrunched up your ears and tightened your muscles, and your shoulders will have gone up. And actually, excess noise creates a stress response. And again, when that's prolonged, it can cause issues. Isolation is something I think a lot of us have experienced in a way that perhaps we haven't before, and I'll come back to that one. Again, musculoskeletal disorders, so manual handling related issues. Again, because of the stress response and what I said about it tightening our muscles, if we then do a lot of manual work, actually that can create excess fatigue in our muscles that then cause injury. So again, there's a relationship. Fatigue, we'll come back to. I've touched on substance misuse, but also, violence, bullying, harassment is a real issue in terms of the impact it has on our psychological health, but also biological, and even temperature. If it's too hot or it's too cold, how that increases your stress and how you're feeling and your ability to cope. So if we move on, I will hand back to Brendon to talk about the dirty dozen.
Thanks, Kate. Some really good foundational stuff there that's important to all of us as managers, irrespective of COVID. It's something we should all know. So we're now going to look at how that links into human factors. So there's a thing called the dirty dozen. So in any situation, human factors need to be part of your planning, risk management, and indeed root cause analysis when things go wrong. In aerospace, there's a requirement for annual training in human factors, particularly in maintenance, repair, and overhaul. But no matter where you are in aerospace, whether you're in the manufacturing supply chain, whether you're in operations, maintenance, repair, and overhaul, cabin crew, flight crew, whatever it might be, all these things are definitely pertinent. I'll refer you back to the example earlier on that I made about the 4 aircraft crashes. 3 of them were due to aircrew error. So human factors are certainly pertinent. So it's often a causal factor or indeed a root cause. And with the current global situation and COVID concerns, mental well-being due to lockdown, not seeing family, having work worries and worried about contamination and taking it back to one's family, concerns about job security, will the company survive, will they still have a job, will the furlough end? So all these stresses are pertinent. So under each of these headings, we can consider elements that are changed and indeed made worse or higher risk brought in due to COVID. So lack of communication. Communication between individuals is important in the workplace, whether it's written work or verbal. So you give a briefing to somebody, or somebody needs to read a route or a work card, or indeed they need to write a route or a work card. If the communication is erroneous, incorrect, not understood, then it can cause a breakdown in communication. And of course, teams have changed. With people being furloughed and reduced workloads, people that used to work together perhaps are not working together anymore. Instead of working in a team of 5, you might have a team of 3, or you might have moved to a different team. So those social norms are going to impact on them. Complacency can be an issue, worried about or lack of engagement and just being nonchalant about the circumstance and being complacent about all those things that could affect your efficacy as a provider, as a worker. Lack of knowledge. We talked about the problem of the new work that maintenance organisations are facing now with putting aircraft into storage, short or long-term preservation, and bringing them out of storage. So they're dealing with new things, new work cars they haven't had to worry about before. Distraction pretty much speaks to itself, but that can be a significant factor, easily being distracted from work, especially if you're new in a team and somebody outside the team comes along to ask you a question or give you a different instruction, takes your eye off the ball for that moment or for that period of time. Lack of teamwork. Teams have changed, teams have been revised. We all know about the forming, storming, norming, performing evolution of teams. If people aren't working as a team, they don't perform. Anyone that's been watching the Six Nations rugby will be able to pick out teams that have been working as a team or not, as the case may be. Fatigue, that's an obvious one. Lack of resources. Things have changed. Resources may not be available, or they might be late coming, who knows? And that could be equipment, it could be materials, it could be people, it could be time even. Pressures, work pressures. We talked about pressures earlier on. Lack of assertiveness. When you see something wrong, speak up. Sometimes people are reticent and they might feel inferior. If you're perhaps the new person in a team, the team has changed and you're the new boy, you may not want to speak up when you see something wrong. You see a team doing something, you know it's not the right way of doing it, you should say so. Don't hold back, because that can bring in stress for you. And we've spoken about the other impacts of stress, but stress in the round can affect how a team works. The other members of the team may not be aware that they're not doing something right. And the reason for that is they've got their own established norms. So all these factors, all these human factors, the dirty dozen, in various ways, can pervade everything we do.
So I think that's a really good overview, and I thought I'd just bring this to life in terms of what it means from psychosocial factors. So for something like lack of communication, actually this is a really good example of that can give rise to the psychosocial risk of isolation. And for those of us that are working from home for the first time, this is a really good example of this. Suddenly we feel bereft of the formal and informal communication network that we had before, and some organizations have really stepped up and been really proactive in ensuring that there's regular communication out to their teams that are home working. But a lot of organizations haven't done this very well, and it just reiterates and underpins this sense of isolation that we have from a psychosocial risk point of view. And if we go on to complacency, so I mean, Brendon touched on this in terms of the impact it can have, but this can often, from a psychosocial risk point of view, be around job content. And this one I always find really interesting, because that job content can be about underutilizing our skills, or not having the right skills to do the job. And this can often be related then to concerns about ongoing career development. And one of the things that it's worth reflecting on in terms of psychosocial risk is that concern about long-term career development can create kind of a low level stress that you might not even be aware of. And actually that reminds me of something that's worth bearing in mind and when thinking about stress and the negative implications for it, is quite often that stress response will build up over the course of months, several months, 3, 6, 12 months, before it becomes problematic. And a lot of people aren't even aware of that. So it is worth thinking about it. Lack of knowledge. So yeah, again, coming back to career development, but Brendon gave a really good example here in terms of, there are new tasks that people are having to do. So in the case that Brendon talked about, ground crew dealing with aircraft that have been stored, that they've just, all sorts of new issues that they're having to deal with. So distraction, so all sorts of things can cause distraction, but a really good one is noise. If we can't hear what somebody's saying to us, then, or if we can't hear an aircraft or a vehicle approaching, then actually that becomes problematic. And this is a real challenge for those who are operating on the apron. There's a lot of noise that is created by aircraft, so a real issue. So lack of teamwork. So this can often be about relationships. Brendon's covered this. One of the reasons that there's such a focus on crew resource management is the need to have really robust interpersonal communications and relationships between flight and cabin crew. But outside of the airline, this industry, this is something that affects all of us in terms of our ability to feel that we are supported by our peers and also our line managers, and that communication is there. So fatigue, so this one can be created by all sorts of things, but particularly at the moment, we've got an issue in terms of workload, where actually there's a reduced workforce. So people are having to do more work because either half the team have been furloughed, actually some of the team might be isolating or actually ill, or in some cases, very sadly, team members have died. So people are doing more work, and obviously that can create fatigue. If we look at lack of resources, Brendon talked about this, right tools, right job. But I think the other thing that a lot of people forget about in this context is, is it being maintained? It might be the right tool at the right time, but if it's not maintained, actually, if it's not easy to use, if it's not working, then that can cause us stress. Pressure, we've talked about, this can be affected by work schedule, and again you see this a lot around things like turnaround times on on the apron. Huge amount of pressure to do that as quickly as possible. Assertiveness, so again Brendon gave some examples of that, and this is why CRM exists for pilots and aircrew. But if we step away from that, one of the reasons that people may be concerned to speak up is actually, they're concerned about violence or aggression or bullying. We saw earlier one of Brendon's examples, where a cabin crew was slapped when they confronted a passenger about wearing a face mask. But the same can be true, in other situations, things like bullying. So a female engineer in a predominantly male working environment can, maybe feeling bullied or harassed, and actually, therefore, they're not willing to speak up. Stress. So this is obviously we've touched on, and one of the things to be aware of is people's coping mechanisms, and that substance misuse, and that can have a huge range of knock-on implications. When we think about what alcohol does to our decision making, our reaction times, all of those sorts of things. And obviously if that becomes then addictive, then that can have much more serious physical and mental ill health concerns. So lack of awareness, again, you know, this is kind of the potentially the known knowns and the known unknowns, all of that piece, you know. So actually, do people understand their role? Do they understand what's expected of them and how to deliver it? And the last one, and if we move on to the next slide straight away, because I'm conscious of time, you know, we need to think about norms, and actually this all comes down to culture, which is the attitudes and behaviours of people, and particularly leadership. So if we move on, all of that has an impact on organisational resilience, you know, because this is all about people. And actually, we've just released our latest organisational resilience index report, and it's found that those organisations that have been the most resilient are the ones that have looked after their people most effectively. So there is this real direct link about what we do for our people and how we look after them, and the implications that has for our organisation in terms of its resilience to cope with short and long-term disruption, and to innovate and be agile. So if we move on and think about extra animation that I forgot about. So why do organisations really struggle to manage these psychosocial risks? Well, it's in simple terms, they don't understand what the issues are, therefore they don't know what to do, and therefore they don't know how to manage it. So if we move on, then there is actually help out there, and that's the new international standard, ISO 45003. Now, this is the first global standard giving practical guidance on managing psychological health at work. It's been developed by the same International Technical Committee that developed 45001. It's in a draft stage at the moment. It will become final draft shortly, and full publication of the final document is due in the summer. But what's available now in the draft, and what that final standard looks like, will change very little. So if you want to start using it now, I'd encourage you to do so. So what exactly does it cover? Well, it goes through and gives information on about what those psychosocial hazards are, and how to recognise them, with actually 3 tables of examples, and you can see one of them on the screen there. And then really importantly, it offers examples of effective and often simple actions that organisations can take to manage those. And they're based on a hierarchy, those actions, in the same way that we will do with occupational health and safety, and particularly safety. There is a hierarchy of prevention that can be adopted. So if we move on, and I'll just highlight the fact that, as I've said, you know, this has been designed to go with 45001, so it follows the same high-level structure, and you can see an overview just to kind of iterate that. So it works really well, and you know, and can be integrated if you have other ISO standards that use the same high-level structure. And if we move on. So one of the things that it's worth bearing in mind with 45003 is it is absolutely focused on action. So demonstrating that what you are doing is happening and is making a difference. And this is really important. So throughout the standard, there's constant checks. Not only have you developed the process, but is the process working? And is it working as you expected it to? Inclusion is really important. So when we think about psychological health and psychosocial risk, the impact of those will be very different based on, you know, individual circumstances. You know, so really simple examples. You know, my experience of a culture as a woman will be different to the experience of a culture for somebody for a man. And actually, it's really important to understand that, you know, the experiences that people of colour have versus white people, again, is very different, and therefore you have to have a really inclusive approach to developing this. you need competency, you need people who are comfortable and understand the issues. You don't need to be a psychological expert, you know, you don't need to be a psychiatrist or anything like that, but you do need to understand the issues and the impact that they can have. I've mentioned controls, and they use slightly different terminology. Primary, secondary, and tertiary is the terminology they use, but it's very similar to eliminate. So primary is really about focusing on elimination. So what can we do to prevent those psychosocial hazards creating harm in the first place? Secondary is, if you like, your engineering and your admin controls from a health and safety point of view, so policies, training, all of those sorts of things. And tertiary is kind of the really reactive stuff. So this is focused on, and it links to the next point, is that, you know, if people do become unwell, is how do you support them, and how do you get them back to work as quickly as possible? So if we move on, we know that the current situation and ongoing of the last 12 months and ongoing for a long time yet, the pandemic is having huge psychological impacts, and we can't underestimate that, and not everybody will bounce back. And as I've mentioned, people who were maybe resilient for the first 3 or 6 months, you know, are finding it much harder to maintain that resilience, you know, and this will have short, medium and long-term impacts. So the stress, but you know, maybe in the short term, but leading to longer term issues in terms of anxiety, depression. We are starting to see evidence, very sadly, that people are taking their own lives at a much higher rate than normal because of the pandemic. And, you know, we also know from previous epidemic and pandemics that post-traumatic stress syndrome is an issue. So organisations need to think not only about how to support their workers now, and in the medium term, but also the long term. And if we move on, I'm not going to go through this slide because you'll have a chance to review it when you get the recording. But this just kind of highlights that, you know, some of the psychosocial risks that, you know, we've seen that are arising from COVID, and some of the things that you can do to actually manage that. And that's drawn out both in 45003, but also the new international standard ISO 45005. And if we move on, we have a poll question before I will tell you about 45005.
Thanks, Kate. So on to poll number 2. Has your organisation used standards, industry guidelines to support your management of safety and wellbeing under COVID-19? Please select 1. Yes, industry guidelines. Yes, standards. Yes to both of those, or no, I'm not aware of relevant standards or guidelines, or I don't know. I'll give you just a few seconds there to answer that. And just a reminder again, if you do have any questions, please feel free to put those in the panel provided. Okay, let's see what our results are for those. So we have 25% yes industry guidelines, 8% yes standards, 25% yes to both, 8% no, I'm not aware of relevant standards or guidelines, and 33% I don't know. So back over to you, Kate, to comment on those results.
Lovely, thank you. So, I mean, that's really interesting. I mean, I think, you know, one of the things with the particularly sort of the more airline side of the aerospace sector is, you know, they're very good at providing industry guidelines, and that's often the go-to. And I have to say, you know, having worked and experienced that industry, they were some of the most prepared for epidemics and pandemics that I've ever seen. But obviously, you know, COVID-19 has been on a completely different scale. For those of you who are not aware of relevant standards, well, I've just introduced you to one, and I will introduce you to the second one. So ISO PAS 45005, safe working during the COVID-19 pandemic. So right at the beginning, we had a poll, and some of you indicated that your organisations had done some, but also some worked in terms of, you know, COVID safe working, but actually some of you indicated little or none. So this is something to be aware of to help your organisations. So ISO PAS, and PAS is publicly available standard. This means it's freely available. It was actually based on the guideline document that BSI developed in the summer last year on safe working. So BSI, you know, saw that organisations needed further guidance on how to work safely during COVID-19, and developed this guide, which was free, and it was, you know, so positively received that actually there was a desire to take this best practice and make it globally available. So it was fast tracked into an international standard, which is now, as I say, PAS 45005. And if we move on, I'll just give you a very quick overview in terms of what it covers. So again, really focused on providing practical examples for organisations on managing the risks associated with COVID-19. It really helps organisations that are dealing with multiple sites or multiple types of workers. So, you know, we've got workers who may still be operating in the manufacturing site, and then we've got people who are working at home. Then we've got people, you know, who may be still moving around, and it provides guidance about helping and supporting for all of those different types of workers. And really importantly, you know, although things feel a little more settled, you know, it's clear that we've still got a few more waves in the literal sense, it would seem. Hearing from Europe, we've got a third wave coming through. You know, there's still the need of organisations to be able to make rapid adjustments as the pandemic develops, and quite often, you know, at short notice. And again, the standard helps with that. And it covers, as I've mentioned, you know, home working, but also a real focus again on inclusivity, and importantly, there is a section on psychological health. So it takes some of the kind of key elements from 45003 and reflects them actually in terms of the impact of COVID-19. And if we move on. So it doesn't follow exactly the same high level structure as 45001. So it was developed by the same technical committee that developed 45001. And if you review it, you'll see that it's very familiar, and a lot of the principles of the high level structure are there, but it's not exactly the same. But it is absolutely based on Plan, Do, Check, Act, which is of course the underlying framework for all management systems. So, you know, it's very clear in terms of that structure, what organisations need to do to plan, then what actions they need to take, that check to see whether it's working, and then acting to fix any problems and continually develop. And if we move on. Again, key points, and I've touched on a couple of these already. You know, there's a really extensive section about how you support those people who are working from home. And I think a lot of organisations have really struggled with this. You know, they've suddenly had a huge chunk of their workforce who are working from home, and they've really struggled to understand how best to support them. And 45005 goes into an awful lot of detail on that. There's a big focus on inclusivity. Now, one of the things, sort of, if you like, unexpected consequences of developing safe working practices within organisations was it had a detrimental effect on certain groups of workers. So things around social distancing actually had a big impact on people who maybe had physical disabilities. So there's a real focus on ensuring that, you know, the actions that you take to keep, you know, the workforce safe isn't having a detrimental impact on others within the workforce. I've touched on psychological health. There's a whole section in terms of, you know, what to do in terms of managing the illness, and basically track, trace and quarantine. How you manage that, what you need to tell workers, how you need to reassure them. I mean, Brendon talked about one of the key issues, you know, real concern about debt, and actually simple things like being very clear as an organisation about how you will pay people if they have to self-isolate is really important. So if we move on, because I'm conscious we are rapidly running out of time, I will hand over to Brendon for the final part.
Thanks, Kate. So we've covered quite a lot so far, and it's worth noting that all of these things come back to the UN SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. There's a range of them here, as you can see, and BSI and a lot of other organisations are signing up to the UN Sustainability and Development Goals. But if you look at some of these headings, you can see that it all ties in perfectly to everything we've covered so far. Whether it's poverty, hunger, good health and well-being, that definitely stands out. Gender equality, Kate talked about inclusion. So all those things fit into the UN SDGs. So we talked about having structure through application of industry guidelines and standards. It would also be worth looking at the UN SDGs to provide structure and provide focus on particular elements. And underpinning all of that, of course, is the word that's been the word of the year, which is resilience. And BSI has its organisational resilience standard, and we spoke about that earlier on, which is it's a guideline standard. It's BS 65,000, and that's the standard on organisational resilience. So there's all this resource out there for you to look at to try and support you in development now. Now, when we moved into the COVID situation and airlines went off the proverbial cliff and the industry struggled, there was a need to establish protocols to try and get people flying again. And it's all down to public confidence. So we need airline public health protocols to live with COVID-19. And it's worth remembering that COVID-19, yes, it's a pandemic, but it's not going to go away. It's going to become endemic, so it will still be there. And I've said in this slide, whatever comes next, if you look back over the last 10, 15, 20 years, we've had SARS, we've had Ebola, we've had various types of bird flu, H8N5, and so on and so forth. So COVID has been perhaps the worst, but we've had others, and arguably we've been lucky so far. So the need for hygiene in airports and airlines isn't going to go away. So we still need public confidence. They need to know that airports and airlines and aircraft are safe and clean for me and my family. I did some analysis on this. It's rather worrying, perhaps, if you're flying short haul aircraft can do anything up to 6 or 7 flights a day. So you might be the last flight of the day, and you might have had 6 other people that have sat in that seat before you. Now, if you extrapolate that across to the number of people using the small room at the back of the aircraft, you're probably sharing that with upwards of 200 people between cleans for the aircraft. So that puts it into some perspective. So businesses. Business travel is an important part of aircraft. Do we want to put our key people at risk by traveling? Because every business has a duty of care to its people. So they're perhaps not going to want their people to fly. So they need to provide reassurance there. For international operations, aircraft traveling between airports, they need to provide confidence to the receiving airport that the people, the aircraft, are clean and hygienic, and that the airport from which they came is hygienic. So mutual recognition between airlines and airports is an important part of this. And international recognition. Is the airline safe? Do they have the hygiene and protocols to protect their passengers and crews? Will they be protecting the people coming into my airport and my country? And I've put the initials AMC there, which is acceptable means of compliance. What is the acceptable means of compliance? And there isn't anything at the moment. There are some protocols out there. But underpinning this is the governments and regulators, and they're having to face a paradox. They want to restore commerce, but they also need to protect the public and the global reputation of the country. So governments are struggling with that. So we need a set of protocols. So BSI has developed a scheme which provides certification for airlines, airports and ground services, which provides all these benefits, demonstrates that your facilities are clean, builds trust, that's really important, builds confidence, and helps governments dealing with those paradox decisions. If every airport and airline was signed up to a hygiene protocol, then the government is helped in its decision making. So we can help people get back on aircraft. We can help governments making decisions on protocols. And to support that, we have the mark of trust from BSI, which can be displayed on airports and airlines and so on. Now, I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to move on quickly to the last poll. I'll hand over to my colleagues again.
Thanks, Brendon. So on to the final poll of the webinar. This is to gauge what kind of information you'd be interested to hear about. So would you like us to contact you on email or phone about any of the following? AS/EN 9100 series certification. If you're an existing client, tick that. The same certification if you're not a BSI client. Health, safety and wellbeing training, or you just simply today soaking up the information. I'm aware that it is now 11 o'clock and we are at the end of the webinar. So I think if I give you just a couple of seconds to answer that and rather address the questions on the webinar, what we will do is take a look at anyone who has submitted a question, and then we'll respond to you in person. So we'll make sure all of those are answered. As we said, you will get a copy of the webinar. Have a look out for that, and please feel free to contact us if you require any more information. So on that note, I'd like to thank Brendon and Kate for a great presentation today and the audience for joining us. We hope you enjoyed the webinar. And finally, please do leave your feedback in the survey, which will run at the end of the webinar. Thank you very much and goodbye.